Hi, my name is Alina Rocha Menocal, and I'm the director of the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice. Thanks so much for tuning in. For the 2025 September-October edition of our newsletter, or what I like to call Back to School edition, I have the pleasure of speaking with Rachel Beatty Riedl, who is the Peggy J. Koenig 78 Director of the Center on Global Democracy in the Brooks School of Public Policy. And she is also a professor in the Brooks School and the Department of Government at Cornell University. Rachel is an expert on democracy and authoritarianism, and she has a particular focus on Africa, but also beyond. Her work focuses on issues related to participation, institutions, political parties, and local governance. And back in the day when there still was a U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, Rachel led the production of the report of the agency's Democracy, Rights, and Governance Learning Agenda. Rachel is the author of the award-winning book on authoritarian origins of democratic party systems in Africa, and the co-author of another book on From Pews to Politics, Religious Sermons and Political Participation in Africa. And she has also authored a plethora of other publications in addition to these. She has been a visiting fellow at the program on democracy at my alma mater, Yale University, as well as at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at Notre Dame and the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. In addition to working with USAID, Rachel has also conducted analysis for the World Bank, the State Department, the Carter Center, and other organizations on issues related to governance, elections, democratic participation, and identity politics. And she also co-hosts the podcast Ufahami Africa, which features scholarly analysis about life and politics across contexts and countries in Africa. So welcome, Rachel, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here with you.
Amazing. And also, as we were talking about just now, we are having International Democracy Day coming up soon. So it's exciting to have this conversation during that juncture. And perhaps we can start with sort of the big topic of our time, which is whether and how democracy might be in crisis and backsliding. So can you give us a sense from your own work and your research, what do you see as the main challenges besetting democratic governance these days, and how is this manifested in different contexts?
Yes, absolutely. A great question to start with because it sets kind of structure for what we're seeing in our contemporary times. And that is to say that over the last 20 years, we've seen a sustained decrease in the number and quality of democracies around the world. So we call this kind of democratic backsliding. And two key features of it are that it is happening in all types of democracies, from advanced industrial, long established wealthy democracies like the United States. And it's happening in newer established, what we might call third wave democracies, those that became democratic in the kind of mid-1970s through the mid-1990s, transitions to multi-partyism that happened around the world. So it's happening in all host of countries across duration of democracy and levels of income that we thought were kind of protective mechanisms. The second key component is the backsliding component. So how backsliding is happening is different from prior periods of autocratization. In prior waves of autocratization, we often saw the transition away from democracy through military civil war or military coups, or transition to single partyism. That's not the modal form of democratic backsliding that we see today. The modal form is the using of nominally democratic institutions like the legislature, the courts, the executive, the bureaucracy to legislate, often legally, or push the bounds of what may be considered legal processes to limit and restrict competition, freedoms for individuals, freedoms of association, freedom of speech, and to tilt the playing field such that incumbents continue to be able to win, to take advantage of their elected status, to concentrate power largely in the executive aggrandizement, and to then make it difficult for opposition thoughts, ideas, competition, and participation in the future. So this is the phenomenon of democratic backsliding, and I think there are a couple of key pillars that are underlying why and how this is happening globally to such an extent. And as I wrote recently in the Journal of Democracy, one of the key phenomenon, the kind of structural underpinning, is what I would term kind of late stage neoliberalism. The extent to which the economy globally is so concentrated in a very strong economic and political fusion of elite power that makes it difficult to exercise what we think of in Dawlian terms as political equality. That we have participation, we have competition, and the third pillar is that our preferences are weighted equally in the conduct of government, so that you and I and everyone within a civic polity have our preferences weighted to be able to form representative government that meets our needs, our protection of our needs. Now, of course, there are debates that's an ideal type. It's never fully been realized, political equality, but that's the principle, the assumption upon which democratic competition translates civic engagement and participation into political outcomes and contestation. What we see now with this incredible kind of structure of inequality and collaboration across autocratic powers or non-democratic actors who just want to continue to enrich and empower themselves, is that political equality becomes ever more difficult, ever more distant from the reality. And therefore, democratic competition is not working. It's giving oversized power to this political and economic elite. So there are, so many implications that flow from that about how democracy is functioning, whether or not democracy is seen to be delivering in the eyes of the population. Often when we look at surveys from across the world, there's great support for democracy, but people want democracy to work better. They want democracy to deliver security, order, quality of life, development, economic opportunities. And it can only do so when you have those foundations in which democracy is responding to the will of the people. Then we also see other components of this late stage neoliberalism around kind of the global media environment, concerns about misinformation and disinformation, and the possibilities, the real opportunities for autocratic collaboration. So democracy is indeed challenged on the global stage all the way down to the local stage. And it's a moment where citizens in particular have to claim their agency in order to be able to have that kind of democratic resilience and resistance.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for such a comprehensive overview and for getting to the heart of a lot of issues that I think are really important. I mean, you mentioned the structural inequality and how economic and political power concentrated in elites have created the conditions for this kind of democratic backsliding. And I think it's interesting to note that in the well embedded, or the democracies that we knew as best established or better established, both the US and the UK have high levels of inequality and growing levels of inequality that actually set them apart from the rest of Western democracies as such. So that's a really interesting point. And you mentioned as something that made me think of Adam Przeworski, because he said at some point that the only democracy to have ever fallen after reaching a certain level of development was Argentina back in the 70s. And I cannot remember his magic number for that GDP, but that's what he said. And I'm wondering now, with what is happening in the US, what do you think of the health and quality of democracy in the US, and is democratic survival at stake?
Mm-hmm. I'm extremely worried about the United States. I think democracy is severely under threat. It's under attack. And there are these components which make Przeworski's law, which held for a long time, really put into question. The extent to which we can read historical patterns of what protected democracy forward into this new extremely globalized era of wealth concentration, scope and scale of kind of global collaboration, and the inability for democracy then to fulfill fulfill its representation distribution function in this and in this era. So we see the ways, if we look at the US in particular and other advanced industrial democracies, you mentioned the UK, we can look at Poland and Hungary, the ways in which democracy is under threat significantly and has declined to different degrees, certainly very significantly in Hungary and Turkey. In advanced industrial countries that were considered above the threshold of democratic nations. So how do we see this happening in the United States? Well, first of all, it is following the same pattern of democratic backsliding in the extent to which it is done by elected leaders, leaders who can claim the mandate of electoral legitimacy. But then they use the courts, the legislature, if possible, the bureaucracy, and the office of the executive, the ministries, the executive orders, etc. Sometimes the police or the military, in the United States case, the expansion of immigration control enforcement, which responds directly to the executive. All of these elements then are being used to limit competition, participation, and freedom of expression, and create costs for opposition critique. So part of what we think of when we think about competitive authoritarianism is the tilted playing field, that it makes it easier for incumbents to stay in power. Part of what we have to think about also is how costly is it for opposition to speak out? What kinds of threats do they then experience? And how much do people gain or entities gain if they're loyalists? That's the flip side of the coin, right? And there we see a kind of model of neo-patrimonialism or enrichment. If you follow the rules, then you're likely to gain from the regime for some certain amount of time. That's not a rules-based democratic order, right? That's a way in which the executive continues to concentrate political and economic power. So I see a concern over, there's a real debate in the United States about to what degree are the institutions holding. And there are ways in which the long established nature of the courts and the legislature and the balance of power, the horizontal accountability institutions that are meant to check each other, are still functioning to some degree, but they're being challenged. And what we see in patterns of democratic backsliding globally is that incremental chipping away starts to become an avalanche. So just because the courts in any country, the US included, made a ruling that seems to protect democracy day one, and then day two, it maybe leaves a little bit of space for executive aggrandizement and the kind of impunity of the executive, less checks and balances. In day three, that has consequences. Certainly in term two, that has consequences. In a world politics piece that I published with Jennifer McCoy and Paul Friesen and Kenneth Roberts, we looked at what we call the kind of two-term principle, or the 10-year principle. After 2 terms of an elected autocratizing incumbent, it becomes incredibly difficult to have any kind of recovery because of that snowballing nature.
Yes, thank you so much. And actually, I was just speaking to somebody yesterday about how the US might or might not be able to recover from this, because there's a lot happening. So thank you for that. Perhaps we can try to look on the upside of this, if there is one. And you were mentioning earlier the role of citizens and what they might be able to do. Can we talk a little bit about what might be possible ways of responding to the democratic challenges that you're talking about, and what resistance might look like, resistance to autocratization and democratic backsliding might look like in different contexts?
Absolutely. So here I'm building on a data set that I'm building out with co-author Paul Friesen, and it's called Democratic Attacks and Resistance Episodes. So we're really looking at the ways in which attacks on democracy happen in this democratic backsliding model, and the types of resistance that are spurred from that, and whether or not or how effective they are. And so that can tell us a lot when we look from particular cases, historical sequences and interactions. It can tell us a lot about how resistance happens across the world. And one of the key findings is very intuitive, and it suggests that the courts in particular are an exceptionally important actor of democratic resistance. They are often the kind of big blocking actor when there are like large scale attacks on democratic institutions by the elected executive and ruling party. Now, one of the key interactions is that courts do not operate in a vacuum. If we think about their role in some of the key cases in Brazil, determining that the past president would not be eligible to run because of prior unwillingness to accept of the electoral results. If we look at the case of Malawi, saying that the election needed to be upheld or rerun so that the electoral results would be free and fair. If we look at the case of Senegal in terms of Macky Sall's preference to delay elections and stay in power longer, the Constitutional Court decided that the elections had to be held according to constitutional term limits and the like. So we see that these courts are operating in really key ways, but they don't do so in a vacuum because they're pushed by civil society. They're pushed by social mobilization around democratic rights. And in particular, the courts are ruling on cases that come to them. Those cases are often coming to them but brought forward by some civil society organization against the government, against the infringement of their own rights, whether it's a political party, a candidate, or an organization in the United States like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, right, that organize the protests, the issue in a way that the court can then rule upon. So the pressure to act, the desire, the demand, courts are meant to be, in this kind of untouchable realm, but they are also responding to the public moment. And so that is a really key way in which we think about the importance of civil society and citizens in claiming democracy, but doing so in a way that also targets their mobilization to relevant institutions that can check the executive in particular. So maybe it's the legislature in a particular moment that's about to pass a bill that would be really limiting to democratic rights. So that citizen mobilization is focused on legislative protests. Sometimes it's that citizen mobilization, it's focused on the courts to be the actor. But some of our findings suggest that that kind of targeting of mobilization is more effective than a kind of diffuse protest, which of course is more difficult. It requires more opposition coalition around a certain agreement that there is a particular threat and the threat can be addressed this way. So it requires more coordination, but it's also more effective.
Thanks so much, Rachel, for that, actually, because it made me think of another article that Tom Carothers and one of his colleagues at Carnegie wrote on democratic bright spots. I don't know if you
Yes.
recall, but they talk about bright spots happening as a result of court action and also as a result of pivotal elections. But they suggest that protests and civil society mobilization has not led to successful resistance against backsliding at the end of the day. But I think how you have framed it here for us, embedding what happens in the courts within the broader context, is very helpful in understanding the role that citizen pressure can still play, albeit not directly, to ensure that courts act. So thank you so much for that. That's very valuable.
And Alina, I can just add on that really briefly.
Yes, of course.
So Erica Chenoweth and her research coming out of the Harvard Nonviolent Action Lab, which, she's been studying protest and collective nonviolent social mobilization for a long time. Her research is also, I think, very much in line with these findings that Tom Carothers and has published on the democratic backsliding, and that our research on the democratic attacks and resistance episodes data is suggesting. Because protest in general is becoming less effective over time. And part of that is to do with autocratic learning. Part of it is to do with the diffuseness. But we do see the necessity and the difficulty of opposition, collaboration, and cooperation. And those kinds of pivotal elections that Tom Carruthers points to also require the opposition to come together in a democracy umbrella, which is so difficult. And then even if they win, which can be a pivotal election, it's very difficult to govern and to bring together this heterogeneous coalition, and make the kind of democratic U-turn that Nick Cheeseman and Jennifer Sear refer to in their new Journal of Democracy piece, make that U-turn stick with a pivotal election because of all of those challenges. But the opposition coalition coming together in a democracy umbrella is incredibly important, and then linking that democracy umbrella to the actual concerns that can bring citizens out in support of them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. That is excellent. And again, thank you for helping to frame and contextualize all of these different research findings from all of the academic work that you and other colleagues are doing. I'm wondering if it's possible to now pivot a little bit further to the role that international actors might play in supporting efforts to strengthen the quality and effectiveness of democracy. How do you think international actors can engage most effectively, and can they, in fact, rise to the challenge?
This is a great question, and also one that's undergoing so much flux with the changing nature of U.S. commitments to democracy promotion more generally. And another change that's happening simultaneously is, of course, Europe determining and thinking about what their democracy support looks like and how they can best support democracy locally and globally. Europe has had to turn to supporting Ukraine as part of its militaristic approach to supporting and upholding democracy, and thinking much more about regional actors in this space. And so democracy support internationally is undergoing a kind of very critical juncture change. And so when we look back, the old system of the last 20, 30 years is not what we're going to see going forward for the kind of democracy support landscape. So one of the questions is then, given this shifting landscape, how can we think about what might work and what might work better? And how can we decenter or recenter the support for democracy that comes from such a numerous and heterogeneous global actors? So I do think that international actors can and must rise to the challenge, in part because there are so many dissidents who are living abroad, and they are a part of this huge coalition. They have so much to share. They're so committed and connected to individual domestic struggles. And so they are a part of this international network. So some of the changes that we might think about are really what I like to think of as kind of offense, defense, and metastructure. Offense is a new idea about democratic renewal that is a global conversation that addresses some of those structural underpinnings that I was talking about. How do we get more political equality at the local level, at the national level, at the international level? How do we get people's desires for a just, secure, and thriving society translated into their political system? Democracy itself needs to have a renewal of many different forms. There's no one prescription, but it is a process that has to be claimed. So I think that kind of democratic renewal can be in part supported by an international network that's very linked in to domestic actors, that's not necessarily based in the US, to be sure, but includes a very heterogeneous group. Then on the defensive side, how do we support democratic defenders across the world? This is the work that's really, the purse has been really dramatically diminished, and autocrats have been emboldened in going after their own democratic societies. So this, I think, is the area where we're still grappling, but there is so much more potential too for democratic collaborators to be in contact with each other, to have democratic learning. And we hope that our research, for example, can help speak to that around, how to target civic mobilization and how to think about what's successful in one place and to have that democratic activist sharing network. So I think there's a lot of on the ground mobilization in that space that's less linked to a specific funding or a specific grant, but is much more about creating communities of knowledge and solidarity. And then the third is the kind of meta landscape, and that is, what will democracy, rights, and governance look like going forward? That is a project to be built, and it's a project to be kind of advocated for as we think about these transnational, local, national, international connections. And so there too, I see a project of renewal. I see a project that builds on like critiques of the past and brings in many new voices. And so in some ways, it's a time of constraint, but out of constraint, I hope that we can see opportunity and like a brighter future.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. I actually really like the way that you are able to think very structurally and sort of, have categories to help navigate what is a very challenging environment and a hefty task ahead for all of us who care about democracy. If I were to ask you to have to leave one word of advice related to democratic resilience and thinking working politically for our audience, what would that be?
It's a great question. And I would love to hear listener feedback on this, their answers to this question, because I do think by crowdsourcing, this is part of how we get there. But I guess my one piece of advice to this audience is about accepting and welcoming and building on the strengths of the heterogeneous coalition that you have. We can disagree on policy later. That is, in fact, the beauty of democracy. It allows us, it encourages us, it welcomes us to disagree on policy. But in order to get there, we have to have the structures, the institutions, the commitments to the rules that allow us to disagree. So, not having litmus tests for those who can be partners, making the very difficult coalitions and then figuring out how to work together with a set of underlying principles that acknowledges differences and actually celebrates them, as hard as it might be, can hopefully contribute to that security in all of our rights being protected and our policy desires to be expressed in the future.
That is an extraordinarily important message that I hope not only our listeners here get to hear, but also all of us outside in the world outside trying to make a difference, because I think what you have said is exactly right. We need to be building coalitions based on shared interests and not be too precious about other things. Thank you so much, Rachel. That is fantastic. And hope you continue to publish all of this good work that you have been doing.
Thank you so much for having me and this opportunity to have this conversation with you. And again, I really look forward to what people have to respond to and their suggestions for democratic resilience as we work together.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.